Hello everyone, and welcome to week 3 of our English composition class. This week we're looking at two different topics, introductions and conclusions, and also strategies for compare and contrast essays. Last week we talked a bit about the parts of an essay. A general essay has an introduction, and in that introduction you have a thesis statement that tells the reader what the topic is and what the author's stance is on that topic. You have body paragraphs or supporting paragraphs. They're meant to be organized in a way that best suits that thesis statement. You're trying to make a case in that thesis statement about the topic, and those body paragraphs should support that. And then we got a conclusion, and there's a couple different strategies for a conclusion at the end. I want to talk specifically about that, but I also want to talk about compare and contrast styles and compare and contrast strategies. Your first essay coming up in a couple weeks is a compare and contrast essay, and there's a few different ways to organize that information, so I want to cover that in this lecture as well. But let's start with introductions and conclusions. Now, for introductions and conclusions, there's a couple different strategies, a couple different types. There's more than this. These are the ones that the book covers, and you could certainly find others if you did some research online. But the main goal of an introduction strategy is to engage the reader. You want to get their attention. You want to get them thinking about the topic. You want to prepare them for what you're going to be arguing and what the supporting paragraphs are going to be informing the reader about. So a couple different ways to do that are a personal anecdote. Generally, for academic papers, I say do not use narratives. Do not use an I perspective, a story about yourself. But in an introduction, it can be appropriate, and it can also be engaging. So if you're writing about something that's a personal topic, you can certainly spend a little time in that introduction telling a story. Don't get too into the story. Introduction paragraph shouldn't be more than 6 or 7 sentences, but you can certainly tell a quick story. An analogy or a comparison is another interesting way to start an essay. An analogy is taking something and comparing it in an unorthodox way to another thing. Mark Twain, in his essay that you're going to read this week, Two Ways to See a River, does this with the idea of being a doctor at the end of his essay. Watch out for that great analogy. So you can certainly start with taking your topic and comparing it to something else. Dialogue and quotation, this is a very common way that students start essays. It's a good way to start an essay. The one thing I would encourage is discuss the quote. Don't just put the quote up there and not talk about it. Make sure the reader knows why you're using the quote and what you want them to take away from the quote. Facts and statistics or a startling claim are also good ways. I love this kind of way to begin a paper. You could use a current news story. You could use something that's going on in the world. You could use a particular fact or statistic that is meant to engage and get the reader interested in what you're going to be talking about. Startling claim, another way to do that. Finally, a rhetorical question, a question that's meant for the reader to think about. And a lot of people start essays this way. I think this is a good way to start as well. Whatever you're doing, you want to make sure that you're engaging the reader and presenting the topic. And then at the end of that presentation, you're going to be giving us your thesis, identifying what you're going to be arguing about that topic. So those are the 3 parts right here of what you want to do. Get the reader engaged, transition to a thesis statement somehow from that introduction strategy, and then present your thesis statement. Here's an example. Working part-time as a cashier at the Piggly Wiggly has given me a great opportunity to observe human behavior. Sometimes I think of the shoppers as white rats in a lab experiment, and the aisles as mazes designed by a psychologist. Most of the rats, customers I mean, follow a routine pattern, strolling up and down the aisles, checking through my chute, and then escaping through the exit hatch, but not everyone is so dependable. My research has revealed 3 distinct types of abnormal customer: the amnesiac, the super shopper, and the dawdler. Now, here we have the introduction strategy of a personal story, an anecdote. And we get some fun details about that personal story at the Piggly Wiggly. Great name for a grocery store. And then you get a transition statement right here. But not everyone is so dependable. We go from story to thesis. And then the thesis is that the research that will be presented has revealed three distinct types of customer. Abnormal customer, the amnesiac, the super shopper, and the dawdler. I'm probably most like the dawdler. Alright, so that gets us through introductions. Think about what you can use for your upcoming essay, compare and contrast essay. Secondly, we got conclusion strategies. How are you going to wrap that paper up? A lot of people just restate the paper and summarize the thesis as well as the evidence that's been presented. I think that's a fully fine way to end a paper. But if you want to try something more interesting, a little more engaging, a little more out of the box, there's some things you can do. One, you can present a new idea. Let's say I was going to be writing a compare and contrast essay about landlines and cellular phones. I might end the paper by predicting or revealing the newest phone, the newest evidence, what's coming our way in terms of phone technology. You can do an interesting comparison, another kind of analogy thing. This is what Mark Twain does in his essay, Two Ways to See a River. He concludes with an analogy, an interesting comparison to being a riverboat captain. And finally, you could do a news story or a current day connection. I think that's a great way to end a paper as well. Those bottom three, I think, are a little bit outside the box. They're a little more challenging, but I think they're fun to write. And the way I write essays, my style, is to figure out what my thesis is, draft the supporting paragraphs, and then actually do the introduction and conclusion at the end, just to make sure I know where I'm going in the paper. Now, compare and contrast information. This is the type of essay that you're going to be writing. We have a compare and contrast essay in this class, we have a definition essay in this class, and we have a research paper and a narrative. This is the compare and contrast essay. Comparing and contrasting is looking for similarities or differences. With comparing, you're looking for similarities. Contrasting, you're looking for differences. There are two general ways to organize this information. I'll get to that in a minute. Usually, not always, but usually, the writer will be advocating for one of the things that they're comparing. Apples are this, oranges are this, but I really love apples. Finally, that analogy style is a great place. A compare and contrast essay is a great place for that analogy style. And that analogy is just like I just talked about as a conclusion strategy to compare two things typically for the purpose of clarification and explanation. Now the different strategies, and you're going to figure out which one you want to use for your paper. As you're reading the compare and contrast essay from this week, I want you to think about what style is the writer using, Mark Twain, in his essay. Subject by subject is where you really keep the two things separate. Let's say I was going to do a paper on landlines and cellular phones. I would have a big chunk of paper on landlines, have a big chunk of paper on cellular phones, and I'd kind of mix them up at the end. But generally, I would keep them separate. You follow the same organization for each separate chunk. So, for cell phones, I want to talk about making phone calls, all the new technology on phones, and how it's changed my life. And then for landlines, I would talk about how you talk on a phone, the technology that exists, not that great with landlines, and then how it changed people's life. So within each of those chunks, I would keep the organization the same. I'd compare them directly at the end. I think subject by subject is good for shorter essays like we're going to be doing. It's just an easier way to think about it, an easier way to put the information together. You keep the things separate, and then at the end, you directly compare them or contrast them. Point by point actually takes those subjects within the chunks and uses them as the guide. So again, phones and landlines. We talked about the three different things being how to use the phone, the technology behind the things or in the landlines and cellular phones, and then how they've helped me out in my life. So rather than keeping the two things separate, I would blend them, and I would have a couple paragraphs about how to talk on the phone. I'd have a couple paragraphs about the technology within these two systems. And finally, I'd have a couple paragraphs about how these things have changed my life. So rather than keeping the two things separate, I take the chunks, the different topics within those two subjects, and I put them together. They're organizing by connecting topic rather than the essay subjects, and this is better for longer essays, but really I've seen some great shorter essays using this style as well. Here's an example of point by point, and for this example I'm comparing USM and I'm comparing SMCC. Now I got three different topics within the subjects I'm going to be comparing. I've got how much the schools cost, what kind of degrees that they have, and then the locations. In subject by subject, again, this is subject by subject, I keep USM separate, and then I keep SMCC separate. And I follow the same organization. For point by point, I would, let's move this over here, use the topics rather than the schools as a method of organization. So for here, I'd have my introduction, and then I'd talk about money. Talk about USM, talk about SMCC. I talk about degree types, USM, SMCC. And then finally locations. I think we know who has the better location. USM and SMCC. Although, I guess it doesn't matter now because of COVID. But, whew, yuck. Alright. So in this version, we've got 3 different topics, 1 subject. And I organize it subject by subject. For the point by point, I take the topics within the subject and I use them. I hope that helps. If you have any questions or concerns, take a look at the beginning section of the Compare and Contrast chapter in Models for Writers. They do a great job explaining it. There's also a really wonderful example there of guns and cameras, comparing guns and cameras. I take a look at that as well. It's a good resource for you as you're thinking about compare and contrast. For this week, you got that essay to read, 2 Ways to See a River. And you have a reading response about that. You have a discussion assignment that asks you to start thinking about this compare and contrast essay. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. All the best this week, and I'll look forward to talking to you next week when we'll be working on the compare and contrast essay.